What would you do if you had worked for the most dangerous man in the city for 4 years, invisible and impeccable and never once late? And one Friday evening you came out of the side office in a red dress because you were going to your sister's engagement party, and the man who had never raised his voice to you in 4 years looked up and snapped, "Where are you going in that dress?" The whole floor heard it. That was the thing. 2 of his men in the outer room, and a driver at the door, and a woman from accounts who had stayed late, and all of them stopped moving, because nobody had ever heard Alaric Neve snap at anybody, least of all at her. And in the ringing silence afterward, an assistant who had spent 4 years being flawless and quiet and easy to work with, looked at her employer and did not apologize, and did not explain, and said something that changed the entire course of both their lives. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman who had made herself convenient for a very long time, and of the ruthless man who discovered exactly what it cost to say the wrong sentence out loud. Colette Byrne had spent her whole adult life being the most competent person in the room and the least regarded. She was 31, soft and generously curved, with a calm, closed face and hands that were never still, and she had been the personal assistant to Alaric Neve for 4 years, which in that world made her either the safest woman in the city or the most exposed, depending on the day. She was superb at it. She had never missed a flight, never lost a file, never once put the wrong 2 men in the same room. And she had learned, at some point, she could no longer identify, to be the kind of person nobody has to think about, which is a useful thing to be and a lonely thing to become. She had absorbed, over 4 years, the standing assumption of everyone who worked in that building, which was that Colette was marvelous, and Colette was reliable, and Colette did not really have a life outside the office, and the humiliating part was that they had been almost right. What none of the men who dictated to her ever bothered to discover was what Colette actually was, which was the last competent stenographer in that city. She had trained at 19 in a court reporting program that closed the year after she finished it, and she could take down human speech verbatim at 240 words a minute in shorthand, which is a skill that has quietly vanished from the world. It had been useless for most of her career, because everybody records everything now. But Alaric Neve did not permit recordings in his building, because recordings can be subpoenaed and copied and leaked, and so for 4 years Colette Byrne had sat in the corner of every serious meeting with a notebook on her knee, taking down every word, and afterward producing a 2-paragraph summary for the file. Nobody ever asked what happened to the notebooks. Nobody could read them anyway. They were, to every man in that building, a page of meaningless squiggles produced by a woman who was very good at her job. And on the Friday evening, everything changed. She put on a red dress in the side office, because she was going straight from work to her sister's engagement party, and walked out past a man who had never once seen her in anything but grey. Alaric Neve was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in charcoal, cut with lethal precision, the head of an organization that owned the freight terminals and the fear of every serious family for 100 miles, and he was rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to, and in 4 years he had never once raised it to her. What happened that Friday was not, in the end, about a dress at all, although it would take him some time to be able to say so. It was that Alaric Neve had spent 4 years constructing a careful arrangement in his own head, in which Colette Byrne was a colleague and an asset, and a person he happened to look forward to seeing, and that the arrangement had held perfectly well for as long as she wore grey and existed only inside the building. And then she came out of the side office in red, on her way somewhere. He was not, and the whole architecture came down in about a second and a half, and what came out of his mouth was, "Where are you going in that dress?" There was a silence you could have stood a coin on. And Colette Byrne, who had spent 4 years being convenient, put her bag over her shoulder and said in a voice that was perfectly level and carried to every corner of that room, "To my sister's engagement party." And then, into the silence, she added the sentence that neither of them would ever forget. She said, "And you do not get to ask me that." She did not slam the door. She got into a taxi and cried for exactly 4 minutes, then repaired her face and went to her sister's party and was charming for 3 hours. And Alaric Neve stood in an outer office in front of 3 of his own men, which had never happened to him in his life, and understood with complete clarity that he had just done something contemptible in public to the one person in that building who had never given him a single reason to. He did not text her that night. He did not send anything to the party. He went home and sat in the dark and did the hardest arithmetic of his adult life, and on Saturday morning he wrote something out 4 times before he was satisfied with it, and on Monday, before she had taken her coat off, he asked her to come into his office and closed the door and remained standing. He said, "What I said to you on Friday was indefensible, and I am not going to attempt to defend it." He did not sit. "I have thought about it all weekend, and I want to be accurate with you because you deserve accuracy. It was not about the dress. It was that you were going somewhere I had no part in, and I discovered that I had an opinion about that, and I had no right to it. And rather than examine the feeling, I put it on you in front of my own men, which is the worst thing about the whole episode." He was quiet a moment. "You were entirely correct. I do not get to ask you that." And Colette, who had come in that morning with 2 weeks' notice, typed and folded in her bag, felt it go very quietly out of date. She said, "Thank you." And then, because she had rehearsed this part too, she said, "I want to say the other half of it." He waited. "I have been extremely good at not being a person in this building for 4 years, she said, "which is partly the job and partly a habit I got into. And Friday was the first time in a long while that anybody here has looked at me and seen somebody who goes places." She lifted her chin slightly. "I did not enjoy how you said it. But I have thought about it all weekend as well, and I do not think I want to go back to being furniture." And Alaric Neve looked at his assistant of 4 years and said quietly, "Then do not." Everything changed after that, and almost none of it in the way the men in that outer office assumed. He did not court her. He did something considerably more disorienting, which was that he started treating her as a participant. He stopped dictating to her and started asking her. He began, in meetings, to say things like, "Colette, you have been sitting in the corner of these rooms for 4 years. What do you think is actually going on with the northern accounts?" And the first time he did it, the entire table looked at him as though he had begun speaking a foreign language. And was right. And she began to unfold. She stopped wearing grey, which was not a small thing. She started finishing her own sentences, instead of trailing off politely, when a man spoke over her. Every evening, after the building emptied, they ended up in his office over a decanter of amber whiskey. He poured for himself and a pot of coffee she made properly, because his was undrinkable, and he told her about the mother he had buried and the brother he had lost, and the trust he had learned to bury with both of them, things he had said to nobody. He learned she flinched at raised voices, and it made him think about Friday every time. And one evening at the door, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and he said, "Tell me to stop." And Colette, who had waited 4 years to be asked anything at all, said, "Do not," and he murmured, "Good night" into her hair, agape mu. But Colette, being Colette, had been sitting in the corner of every serious meeting in that organization for 4 years with a notebook on her knee. And there was something in one of those notebooks that had been bothering her since March. The cruelty came at a formal reception, and it arrived in a dress that cost more than a car. Céline Marchand had spent 2 years positioning herself to become the next Madame Neve, on the entirely reasonable basis that their families had discussed it, and she had watched the assistant come out of grey with the particular horror of a woman who has understood something before anybody else has. She cornered Colette by the tall windows with an audience assembling. "Oh, the assistant," Céline said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Colette's body with theatrical sympathy in red. Again, she smiled like a blade. "I am going to be kind because nobody else here will be. Men who are alone too long become attached to whoever is nearest, and you have been nearest for 4 years, and that is not the same as being chosen. When he comes back to himself, he will want a woman who can stand at the front of a room like this, and nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at a fat girl who takes notes in the corner and sees a wife. Do go back to the corner, sweetheart. You are wonderful in it." The temperature by those windows dropped 20 degrees, and the old Colette would have absorbed it, agreed pleasantly, and gone to check the car. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that I take notes in the corner," Colette said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect clarity. "For 4 years. Which means I have written down every single word that has been said in every serious meeting in this organization since I was 27. She tilted her head. "Verbatim, Céline. Not summaries. Every word exactly as it was spoken, in a system nobody in this building can read, which is precisely why everybody in this building has always spoken very freely in front of me." She let it sit. "So do be careful whose corner you are sending me back to. I have 4 years of everybody in this room in a drawer, and I remember which of you thought I was a piece of office equipment." The silence had teeth. Céline Marchand went the colour of the tablecloth and left. And Alaric, who had crossed the floor without hurrying, took Colette's hand and put it through his arm in front of the entire reception and said to the room, "This is the person who has been in every meeting I have ever held. You never make yourself small in this house again, agapimu." But past Céline's shoulder, a man who had stood at Alaric Navy's right hand for 16 years had gone very still because he had just heard an assistant say the word verbatim out loud in public, and he had spent 2 years talking in front of her. The man was Warwick, and he was the closest thing Alaric Neve had to a brother, and he had made one assumption, and it was the same assumption everybody in that building had made, which was that the notebooks did not mean anything. For 2 years, Warwick had been quietly negotiating the sale of the northern freight terminals to a rival house, in a scheme so patient and so well constructed that it had survived 2 audits. It required no documents. It required only that certain meetings reach certain conclusions, that certain numbers be presented in certain ways, and that certain objections be raised at the right moment by the right man and then withdrawn. And Warwick had done all of it out loud, in rooms, in front of people, because he was not a fool and understood that anything written down can be found. He had been magnificent. He had also, in every one of those rooms, been 3 feet from a woman with a notebook on her knee, writing down every syllable he said, in a system that had gone out of use before he was born. He had watched her do it 100 times and never once thought about it, because the summaries that came back were always 2 paragraphs, and always innocuous, and because it had never occurred to him that the squiggles were words. Warwick smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Colette brought it to Alaric that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, in order, with a stack of notebooks on the desk between them. She said, "In March I transcribed a meeting about the northern terminals, and I remember it because something in it did not sit right, and I could not work out why. And I have gone back through 4 years this week, and now I can. And then she read to him. That was the part he would never forget, that his assistant of 4 years sat in his office and read aloud from squiggles, in Warwick's own words, sentence by sentence, from 11 separate meetings across 2 years. She read him, Warwick raising an objection to evaluation in the January of the first year and withdrawing it 4 minutes later on grounds that made no sense. She read him Warwick 8 months later, describing that withdrawn objection as though it had been settled by an assessment that never took place. She read him the meeting where a rival house's name had been mentioned once, glancingly, by Warwick himself, in a context so casual that nobody in that room had registered it. 11 months before that house made an approach nobody was supposed to have expected. She read him 4 years of a man building an argument in public so slowly that no single meeting had ever looked like anything. Alaric Knave sat with his hands flat on the desk and did not move. And then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice, and he did not ask her to prove that the shorthand said what she claimed it said. And afterwards she understood that this was precisely the point, that a man who had said one unforgivable thing to her in an outer office was never going to fail to believe her again. "Warwick," he said quietly. "Yes," said Colette. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at those notebooks and at you, because you are the only person alive who can read them." And neither of them knew that Warwick had already made that decision. The building went dark at 2:30. Colette was there, because she had been there every night that week, transcribing 4 years into typed pages, and the power died and took the lights and the lift and the alarms, and every instinct, 4 years in that organization, had homed, screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Alaric had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Colette, sitting in the dark in an office on the 11th floor with 200 notebooks stacked around her, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away and that they had come for her. And for a stack of paper nobody in the world could read but her. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not run. She thought cold and clear, the way she always had at 7 in the morning, when 3 things had gone wrong before anybody arrived. Somewhere below, a stairwell door opened, and Colette Byrne did the thing that no one in that organization, friend or enemy, had ever thought to account for, because they had all made the same mistake about the notebooks, and she was about to make that mistake expensive. She did not hide the notebooks. She did the opposite. She had spent 4 years watching men in that building make decisions under pressure, and she understood something about the man coming up those stairs, which was that he was thorough, and that a thorough man who finds 190 notebooks will count them, and a thorough man who finds none at all. So she left them stacked in plain sight on the desk, all 200, and took the 11 that mattered, the ones from the meeting she had read aloud, and did the one thing a man like Warwick would never think of, which was to put them back on the shelf in the 9th floor archive, in date order, among 400 identical notebooks belonging to an organization that never threw anything away. Then she went to the print room, where the old wired line ran on its own circuit, and made one call. And then she went and stood in the stairwell between the 10th and 11th floors, in the dark, where she could hear everything and be seen by nobody, because she had walked that stairwell twice a day for 4 years when the lift was slow and knew exactly which of the steps announced themselves. She heard them come up, heard 2 men go into her office, and heard quite distinctly a man counting under his breath. And then she heard the unhurried footsteps of somebody who had not gone into the office at all, who had stopped on the landing below her, and who said, into the dark stairwell, in the voice of a man she had brought coffee to for 4 years, Colette. She did not answer. "I am not going to pretend," Warwick said. He sounded tired. I have known you for 4 years, and I like you, and this is not what I wanted. He was quiet a moment. Do you know that I have thought about those notebooks every day for 11 days, and I still cannot make myself believe it. 2 years. Every word I said, he almost laughed, in front of you. I used to watch your hand moving and think, God, she is quick. And never once, not one single time did it occur to me that you were writing down what I meant. And Colette Byrne, standing in a dark stairwell with her back against cold concrete, did the one thing he never expected, because she had never once been the harmless thing he took her for. She spoke. That is the whole of it. Warwick, she said, and her voice came down the stairwell from a direction he could not place. Nobody in that room ever thought I was writing down what you meant. Silence. Your men are counting notebooks, she said. There are 200 on that desk, and they are all real, and none of them matter. The 11 you want went back into the 9th floor archive 4 hours ago, in date order, among 400 that look exactly the same, and you could stand in that room until Thursday and not know which ones to burn. She let it settle. And it would not help you if you did, because I typed them. Warwick. Every one. 11 meetings, verbatim, in plain English, with dates, and they went out of this building on Tuesday to 3 separate places, one of which is a solicitor's office, and one of which is not in this country. She paused. You were extremely careful never to write anything down, and you talked in front of me for 2 years, and I wrote all of it down for you. Warwick said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to a confession she would ever get. And in that silence, the ground floor doors came inward, with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits, because Alaric Nev had understood, somewhere on a road on the other side of the city, that the meeting he was driving to did not exist. Time seemed to fracture. There was noise below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Warwick turned toward it, and Colette, who had walked that stairwell twice a day for 4 years, and knew which steps were silent, was already moving upward instead of down, which is the direction nobody ever expects, and was through the 11th floor fire door, and behind it, before he had taken 3 steps. And then the stairwell filled with torchlight, and Alaric came up it, 2 steps at a time, soaked to the skin, his eyes wild and searching, and Milo, his loyal second, came behind him with a crowd of men, and the trap Warwick had spent 2 years building closed around him instead, on a landing in the dark, with 2 of his own men upstairs counting stationery. See, Alaric had him against the wall by the throat before he could speak. 16 years, he said, and his voice was almost gentle. You sat at my table and sold my terminals out loud, and when a woman wrote it down, you came into this building for her. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Warwick to Milo's men and came through the fire door and found her standing against the wall behind it. Are you hurt? He demanded, his hands moving over her arms, her face, her shoulders. Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me. I am fine, Colette said, steady even now, though her fingers curled into his soaked coat. They are counting notebooks in my office. There are 200. It will take them until about 4. And Alaric Nev made a sound that was not quite a laugh into her hair, and then framed her face in his shaking hands, and looked at her the way nobody in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. 16 years he stood beside me, and 2 audits and 4 accountants found nothing, and you had him from a notebook. Nobody in this building can read. And then his voice cracked open, entirely. Do you know what I understood? That Friday? He said hoarsely. Not when you walked out. Afterward, when I was standing there in front of my own men, and everybody was looking at the floor, he pressed his forehead to hers. That I had spent 4 years letting you be furniture, because it was comfortable for me, and that the first time you were visibly a person with a life. My reaction was to try to put you back. I have been apologizing for that sentence in one way or another every day since. Warwick, who had smiled at Alaric Nev for 16 years while selling him out loud in his own meeting rooms, learned the price of underestimating her before the month was out. Alaric did not act in blind rage. He let Colette lay the whole of it before the family's 11 meetings across 2 years, read out in her own voice from her own notebooks, and matched line by line against the typed transcripts. With the original shorthand pages held up so that a room full of powerful men could look at 4 years of squiggles and understand exactly what they had been talking in front of, there was a very long silence in that room. And when it was done, and the rival house that had been buying the terminals was exposed, along with him, Colette did not counsel death. You do not need to make him a martyr, she said quietly. You need to make him nothing. So they did it her way. Warwick was stripped of everything and cast out alive, and what followed him for the rest of his life was not the betrayal, but the manner of it, because the story went round every family on that coast inside a month, and it was always told the same way, that Warwick, who never wrote a single thing down in 2 years, had been undone because the girl in the corner did it for him. He was not destroyed. He was simply, permanently, a joke, and the old men agreed that was considerably worse. And Céline Marchand, who had said that nobody looks at a fat girl who takes notes in the corner and sees a wife, discovered that a number of conversations she had had in rooms where Colette Byrne had been sitting were now being read back to serious people, and spent a long and humiliating season explaining a great many things. And afterward, watched from the far end of every room, Colette now stood at the front of. A year later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Colette Byrne stood at the head of a long table running a meeting that 11 men listened to without once interrupting, and there was not a notebook on her knee because she had people to do that now. And because the position she held did not have a name in that organization until they invented one for her, she wore rich collars cut to celebrate every curve she had spent 31 years being told to play down, and she wore red whenever she felt like it. Alaric came in at the back and stopped, simply to watch her work. "You are staring," she said afterward, without looking up from her papers. "I will never stop," he said, crossing to her. "Do you know what I understood? That Friday," he said quietly. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Every man in this organization talked in front of you for 4 years because they had decided you were not really there, agapi mu, and the only reason any of us still has anything is that you were there the whole time writing it down." Colette looked up at the man that whole city was frightened of, who bowed to nobody, and yet had stood in his own office one Monday morning, refusing to sit until he had finished apologizing, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 4 years being marvelous and reliable and easy to work with, which is another way of saying invisible, and she had proven every last one of those comfortable assumptions wrong, because the skill the whole world had let go obsolete, the ability to take down what a man actually says rather than what he means to be remembered saying, had saved an organization and a life. He had snapped at her about a red dress in front of 3 of his own men. She had told him in a level voice that he did not get to ask her that. And by the time his enemy understood what she was, the assistant they had all talked in front of for 4 years had 200 notebooks, 11 transcripts, and every word any of them had ever said. If Colette and Alaric's story of hidden worth, quiet nerve, and a line drawn at exactly the right moment moved you, if something in you stood up when she said you did not get to ask me that, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who spent years being described as marvelous and reliable by people who never once asked what else they could do. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below And tell us, what was your favorite moment in Colette and Alaric's story?